coming out. This is Lubbock Liberty workshop event, and Lubbock Liberty is just a group of people that decided that we needed to talk about the issues that pertain to our liberty. And it started with a few precinct chairs from the Republican Party, but it is bipartisan. Our events are about liberty, and liberty spans all parties. And so it's good to see familiar faces in here. I do want to remind everybody we are recording this so that we can actually send this information out to millions of people. I mean, lots and lots of people can see these things for years to come, as long as we still have the internet working. And so I really appreciate y'all coming out. As far as announcements goes, I just want everybody to check out LubbockLiberty.com and spread that website to anybody that you can, because they can go back and see previous events that we've recorded. And we've had many guests. We've had our first guest speaker was actually Dr. Benjamin Powell of the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech, and so we're pleased to actually have several of their members come out and talk to us after that. Michael Ward was one of our speakers as well, talking about local issues that are very, very important. That's where we should have the most power, is on the local level as far as government goes, and on the individual level. And that's what liberty is about. So I appreciate all these organizations getting together, and I appreciate the collaboration with the Free Market Institute and the Constitutional Society. Mallory, thank you, and Larry, always for your support for our Lubbock Liberty events. And thank you for your understanding that these are very important, that it's important to come together and have a discussion about things that matter and that affect our liberty, because that's what we should be looking at. It's particularly a topic that we should be focusing on, I think, more than any other topics in the political climate right now especially. We need to be focusing on money and the rule of law, and this is why this presentation with Alexander Salter from the Free Market Institute is going to be paramount to our political environment right now, especially, and for years to come. I almost wish that more of our candidates that are available to us from all parties would focus on the money and the economic system, our monetary system, and the way that we have it now. We've got problems, and I think everybody in this room knows that we have problems with it, and most of us are in agreement with free market principles more than any other types of economic systems for our government. And so I just want to really highlight the fact that this right here, the money and the rule of law, is most important. It is paramount. And so I'd like to introduce our speaker today. I've kind of already mentioned him. Alexander Salter, PhD, Comparative Economics Research Fellow and Assistant Professor of Economics for the Jerry S. Rawls College of Business Administration at Texas Tech University, and of course part of the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University as well. So Dr. Salter earned his BA in economics from Occidental College, actually, and his MA and PhD in economics from George Mason University. Prior to joining Texas Tech University, he was an assistant professor of economics at Berry College. Dr. Salter's research focuses on comparative political, economy, and institutional analysis. He's interested in topics related to monetary economics and macroeconomics, and especially which monetary and macroeconomic institutions best promote economic stability. His research interests also include the economics of governance in the tradition of Virginia School of Political Economy, investigating which governance rules effectively align with the incentives of governors with the welfare of the governed. In addition to conducting scholarly research, Dr. Salter also serves as an adjunct program officer with the Institute of Humane Studies at George Mason University, a project fellow with the Atlas Sound Money Project, and an associate editor of the Journal of Private Enterprise. And then you can always go visit his website at awsalter.com. And I encourage you to speak to him after the event as well. Thank you so much for coming out. And without further ado, Alex Salter.
Great, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm very excited to be here talking about one of my favorite topics, money and the rule of law. There's not much that can get me out of bed before 9 a.m. on a Saturday, but this happens to be one of the few things that can, so I'm very excited to share my thinking on this with you. So just to give you a brief idea of where we're going, first I want to do some light economic theory. We got to understand what money is and why it's important before we can talk about why it matters, whether it's lawful or not. We're going to spend a little bit of time analyzing the monetary institutions that have existed in the Western world for about the last 100 years, central banking. And then we're going to move on to some alternatives to see if we can't, A, make central banking more lawful, and B, maybe even radically reconsider central banking itself. So why don't we get right into it? What is money? At its essence, we need to understand what money is, why we use it, why it's important. Really, money is a good for indirect exchange. When we use money, we trade what we produce for some intermediate good, and then we turn around with that intermediate good and use it to trade for what we actually do wish to consume. It's an indirect exchange good. We call that in economics a medium of exchange. Now, there are other functions of money. If you've ever cracked an Econ 101 textbook, you can find all three. Medium of exchange is usually listed first. You usually also have the functions of a store of value. Money is a means of preserving wealth over time. But a lot of other assets can do that, so that's not unique to money. And money is also a unit of account, which is basically a fancy way of saying that's what prices are posted in. When you're asking how much you want for an apple, the price tag attached to that, that's what it means for something to be a unit of account. Now, if something is a medium of exchange, it pretty much implies the other functions, but the other functions don't necessarily imply the existence and use of a medium of exchange. In ancient Greece, for example, the unit of account was oxen. But it's not like people were taking around oxen and using them as mediums of exchange. So we had a unit of account, but not necessarily what we would call money. So where does money come from? There are sort of two dominant views in the economics literature. One says that money is a spontaneous order of the market process. Spontaneous order is just a fancy way of saying the product of human action, but not of human design. It's something that emerged from decentralized decision making. It wasn't anyone's intention, but nonetheless it's an institution that helps them fulfill their wants. The other school says that money is really the invention of the state, in particular a benevolent philosopher king. Someone who comes along and says, hey, this barter economy, it's okay, but it's mightily inefficient. I have an idea, money, and then introduces it. Not much anthropological evidence for the philosopher king view. A lot of people who embrace the philosopher king view are mistaking money and credit. Those are two distinct things. Money is the medium of indirect exchange, or medium of exchange rather. Credit is an instrument in which money is priced. And credit, basically borrowing and lending, existed before money, right? But we don't want to confuse those two things. So when we look at the emergence of money, the economist we want to study is a fellow named Carl Menger, who in an 1892 journal article called On the Origins of Money basically wrote, money is the result of a snowballing effect in markets. Let's say you're a rancher. You have cows. You want to bring your cow to market and trade for some good that you finally want to consume. The problem is cows aren't very tradable. They're lumpy. You can't cut a cow into smaller pieces and still have it be a cow. Bad things happen when you try and do that, right? Costly to store. They require upkeep. So they're not very saleable, very liquid, we might say. So what's a smart rancher going to do? Well, I want to consume potatoes. But instead of trading my cow directly for potatoes, I'm going to trade it for something else. Anything else, provided that I think that that anything else will be more readily exchanged for potatoes. Now let's say that the farmer picks wheat. Wheat's a little bit better, right? You can cut wheat into smaller portions. It's already harvested, so it's not like you're going to damage it. They're homogeneous, which basically means that a bushel of wheat is as good as another one. Not the case with cows. You can have a robust cow and a sick cow, a fat cow and a skinny cow. So there are properties of goods that enable them to serve as better for indirect media of exchange. Of course, we can think about what this process converged to, gold, the precious metals, and these have really nice properties as media of exchange. They're not very costly to store, they're easily divisible into smaller parts, and they're valuable in and of themselves. People made jewelry out of gold before they started using gold as money. So usually when you have one or a small handful of these commodity objects that serve as media of exchange, that's when the dovetailing process has completed and your economy has converged and become a money-using economy. Why is money nice? so to speak, economically? Why do we like it? Two main reasons. Well, obviously, money can help us economize on the search costs that plague a barter economy. Barter economies have the problem of what we call a double coincidence of wants. Remember, if I have a cow and I want potatoes, not only do I have to find a guy who has potatoes, that guy has to also want my cow. Double coincidence of wants problems. You have to find someone who has what you want and wants what you have. With money, that problem goes out the window. If everyone's accepting money, then I don't have to go out of my way to look for a specific trading partner to get something that that trading partner wants. That's obviously very important, since doing that is costly. Now we have a bunch of other resources, namely time, left over that we can do other stuff with. At least as important is that money is a common denominator in economic life. You're a rancher. You trade your cow for 3 sacks of potatoes and a yard of rope. Have you made a profit? There's simply no way to tell, right? Because there's no common denominator for comparing the value of production processes. Money enables that common denominator. All of a sudden we have accounting available to us. Accounting has been called by sociologists the rationalization of economic logic, and for good reason. Because all of a sudden we have an objective means to compare across various production projects how in demand some goods and services are relative to other goods and services. So with economic accounting, we have access to perhaps the most important sub-institution of the economic system, the profit and loss system. Profits in economics are symbols of value that is created. So long as trade is voluntary, if I am able to sell a good above cost, the degree to which I'm able to sell a good above cost represents adding value to those resources in dollars. If I sell a good at a loss, that's commensurate with me actually, probably not intentionally, but destroying resources. If you make an economic loss, remember this is all measured in dollars now because we have money, I've taken resources valued at X and inadvertently transformed them into something worth less than X. So that's a destruction of resources. Now with the profit and loss system, we can actually have a coordinating market process. Right? The most salient feature of markets is that you don't need to call up the shoe store and say, I'm going to go buy a pair of shoes, have them ready for me in a week. No, you can just walk into the shoe store and buy a pair of shoes. Walk into the supermarket and buy a gallon of milk. The city of Paris gets fed, even though nobody who lives within the city bounds of Paris is a farmer or a rancher. That's a massive coordination project. How does that actually happen? How does the availability of goods and services that we take for granted actually work? The answer is the market price system that would have been impossible without money. Market prices, denominated in money, dollars, let's say, perform 3 roles. First, prices are ex ante guides to action. I'm thinking about opening a pizzeria. I expect, using current market prices as a proxy, that my resource costs are going to be X, and I'm going to be able to sell my pizzas for Y. To the extent that Y is more than X, that's a profitable enterprise. That gives me the expectation that I can go into that line of production and add value to society's scarce resources, and thereby make the plans of consumers better mesh with the plans of producers. Now, of course, that's ex ante. We also have to talk about the price system ex post. Prices ex post tell you if you were actually successful. It's all well and good to say that I expect to make a profit. After you've gone out and done the thing, you can look back, do the bookkeeping, and say, have I made a profit? If yes, that's a pretty good indicator that your production plan is a good idea, economically speaking. Again, the standard that we're embracing is adding value to society's scarce resources. And if you've made a loss, that's an indication that you're either making the product wrong, right? There's more than one way to make a pizza, so you might want to change how you make the pizza to cut costs. Or that there's just not a big enough market for more pizzas in general, and you should get out of that business. Either way, that's good for you personally. You stop making losses. But it's also good for society, since you're no longer inadvertently destroying wealth, destroying the value of resources. Finally, prices serve as an entrepreneurial guide. Entrepreneurship in economics is defined as many ways. I'm defining it here as the assumption of uncertainty. Things that we don't know about the future that cannot be quantified perfectly. If we have some unknown state of the future and that can be quantified perfectly, we call that risk. And that's pretty easy to deal with. Uncertainty, the unknown unknown, so to speak, that's much harder to deal with, but it obviously permeates economic life. Bearing that, actually engaging in new production processes, that's entrepreneurship. And the price system helps entrepreneurs coordinate too, because they can imagine various production processes that put resources together in new and imaginative ways. When we look at the economy, what we don't necessarily observe is the comparative static supply equals demand. We're done now with economics and economic models. We see change. We see innovation. We see growth. All of these are features of entrepreneurship properly conceived. And none of those things, profit and loss accounting ex ante and expectations, ex post, and entrepreneurship, would be practicable without a system of market prices guiding their action, which in turn would be impossible without money. So again, the formula is that money plus market forces equals economic coordination, the meshing of the plans of consumers, what we want to buy, with the plans of producers, what they want to produce. When that gets out of line, when consumers want stuff that producers aren't producing, that's when we have what we might call a coordination failure in economics. But with money, we at least have the mechanisms which, if there is a coordination failure, we can A, identify it, and B, fix it. Those are very important. Without a money-using economy, it's not even clear that the concept of errors in production processes make any sense. Now we know that all this results in the question.
Yes. Would you explain how economic coordination occurs without central planning?
Economic coordination occurs without central planning precisely because of this price system that we have. Right? Individuals use the price system as knowledge itself and as a surrogate for knowledge. This is the point that F.A. Hayek makes in his work. He didn't win the Nobel Prize for this work. F.A. Hayek was the Nobel laureate in 1976, I believe. But he also did the foundational work on knowledge in the information system. Imagine that you wanted to build a railroad. You have two choices for your rails in this hypothetical world: steel and titanium. What are you going to use for your rails? Well, if you're sensible, you're probably going to use steel. Why? Both steel rails and titanium rails would work. They're both sturdy. They both get the trains where they need to go. They both do approximately a serviceable job. But here's the thing: steel is way cheaper than titanium. That's society's way of telling you the value of the resources used up in running trains is lower for steel than for titanium. How would you know that without the market price system? You couldn't. Imagine that there is a late freeze, so the crop of oranges for this year gets destroyed. Market price of oranges goes up. Imagine God was actively planning the economy, and God was an economist, and so he wanted to maximize efficiency. What would God say? Well, fewer oranges than we expected. Therefore, at the margin, the next additional orange is more valuable. We want to economize on its use, make sure that only the most valuable use of oranges gets picked, and the people who have less valuable uses of oranges get dropped out. What does the consumer of oranges do? Well, if the supply of oranges goes down, all else being equal, the market price is going to rise. That's going to result in consumers economizing on the use of oranges, which is exactly what you would want to happen if oranges became more valuable because they became more scarce. Right? So here we have an example of individuals actually using prices as substitutes for knowledge and knowledge itself to help them coordinate their plans with each other. And again, none of this would be possible under central planning. If you had central planning, you have no private property. If you can't have private property, you can't have markets. And if you can't have markets, you can't have market prices. So all that nice information generating stuff goes out the window. You need the decentralized competitive market process operating in an environment of competition and freely adjusting money prices. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Great. So we know, moving now to macroeconomic considerations, where I'm using a slightly idiosyncratic definition of macroeconomics, and I'm going to speak about macroeconomic success or failure as a coordination problem primarily, which it really is, even though modern economics doesn't always use that language. So we know that market coordination, the coordination of all markets in the economy, depends on money prices. But what coordinates the market for money? Here we seem to have a small gap in the economic system because money is money if and only if it doesn't have a market in which it is independently priced. If the market for apples is out of whack, market prices will adjust to bring it back into coordination. What happens when the money market is out of coordination? Well, we can speak of the dollar price of apples. The only way that we can talk meaningfully about the price of money is talk about the apple price of dollars, the reciprocal. So the price of money is really a weighted average of all the other relative prices throughout the economy. So if the money market is, again, not well coordinated, if there's too much money in the system or not enough money in the system at its current purchasing power, the only way for that to adjust is for all these relative prices across the economy to adjust to bring the money market de facto back into a coordinated equilibrium. that can be very, very costly. It can take a long time. There's no guarantee that we're going to get it right. It's something that, understandably, we would hope that there's an institutional solution for, because we can't simply rely on the money market to take care of itself without some supporting underlying institutions. Note that this isn't a central planning argument. The market's not going to take care of itself unless we have private property rights and the rule of law and all these other foundational institutions of post-Enlightenment, classically liberal society. So it's reasonable to embrace also some institutional fix that's going to make sure that the money market doesn't get too far out of coordination. Right? Money is the hub of the wheel. Markets are individual spokes. If any one market isn't working, the wheel can still work. But if there's something wrong with the hub, there's something wrong with the whole wheel. And so we definitely want to make sure that the hub is in working order. Otherwise, our market system is not going to function well. So monetary coordination, sometimes called monetary equilibrium, you can see as the fundamental goal of monetary institutions. We do want something to adjust the supply of money in the economy as supply and demand conditions for other goods and services adjust. What happens if you have too much money in the system relative to how much people want of it? Well, then you have an artificial boom. Money gets artificially cheap, we bid up all goods and services prices, and an artificial boom is just as bad as an artificial bust. It's a waste of resources, it's inefficient. Of course, not enough money, that's much more obvious about the pernicious effects of that. If there's not enough money in the economy at its purchasing power, producers are going to have to lower their prices. Losses means people are going to get laid off. You get the traditional Keynesian death spiral, right? So there's a certain logic to that. But it's important to recognize that that in no way, shape, or form depends on the government's budget deficit, which Keynesians would point to as the primary mechanism, right, for assuring that we have our full employment equilibrium. What we got to look to fundamentally is the market for money. And so we're hearkening back to an older tradition in economic theory, going back far beyond Milton Friedman and even the Austrian economists. So what is the monetary institution that exists today to solve this problem? There's only one: central banking. The Federal Reserve in the United States, ECB for the Eurozone, Bank of England, et cetera, et cetera. Now, a central bank, at least the Federal Reserve, has a monopoly on the issuance and destruction of base money. You can't issue money if you're not the Fed. So whether they like it or not, the Fed is responsible for money supply and money demand problems. Why? Because by law, there's no other institution that can address it by changing the quantity of base money in the system. So if there's money mischief going on, by definition, it's the Fed's responsibility, if not fault. How well has central banking worked over the past 100 years? Since I'm on camera, I'll say not great. I would say something else if I were not on camera. Not great, especially the Federal Reserve. Let's just look at the Fed. Compare the pre-Fed period and the post-Fed period. Before the Fed, we had a national banking system. It was actually called the national banking system, where in order to operate a bank, you had to get a government charter, post so much collateral with the national bank comptroller or the state bank comptroller if you were still operating under the state banking system. And you were actually allowed to issue your own money, provided it was redeemable in gold, because otherwise nobody would have accepted it back then. So in that national banking system, you had multiple and decentralized nodes of money creation and destruction. We've replaced that with one centralized node of money creation and destruction. And you don't need to be a systems engineer to know that one point of failure tends to be less stable than multiple points of failure. How has it actually worked? Well, after the Fed, the US has actually experienced more macroeconomic instability, not less. The whole justification for the Fed behaving like a modern central bank is to get rid of the boom-bust cycle. We just haven't seen that. The Great Depression, the Great Recession, all the myriad of smaller things in between, the Fed has messed up quite a bit. Central banking is really, really hard. I don't fault the central bankers per se. My instinct is to fault the institution itself. We'll get to that more in a little bit. Even if you exclude the Great Depression, even if you exclude everything before World War II, the Fed was young, say the macroeconomists. It was still learning. You can't hold that against it. Now that central banking is mature, we understand it. We have it down pat. And if you were giving this talk sometime between 1983 and 2007, by God, you would have been right. We had the Great Moderation, recessions were small, few and far between. Economists, really, really smart people with PhDs were saying, we've solved the business cycle. Macroeconomics is done. We've perfected central banking. We don't need to study macro anymore. Just let the central bankers handle it. It'll take care of itself. And then 2007 happened. So clearly, this is not the end of macroeconomic history. Let's focus on the Great Recession, the most recent crisis, really quickly. I think we can indict the Federal Reserve's behavior on two margins. First, they fueled the boom itself by keeping interest rates too low for too long before the crisis. Right? In the short run, monetary policymakers do have some control over interest rates. In my view, monetary policy makes too much of the relationship between money and interest rates. Nonetheless, it's true that in the short run, the Fed does have some control over short-run interest rates. Second, after it was obvious that bad stuff was happening in financial markets and that was spilling over into final product markets, the Fed did not do enough to stabilize the economy. So it made the whole problem in the first place, and then when the problem became manifest, it didn't do enough to fix it. Those are my contentions. So these two graphs that I'm going to show you are just flying around Google Images. This isn't mine. I didn't make this. You can get this from half a dozen economics papers at least at any given time. What this graph shows is in blue the actual federal funds rate, which is the interest rate that the Fed targets when it's conducting short-run monetary policy. And the red line is what we call the estimated Taylor rule interest rate, which is just a fancy way of saying this is our best guess for what interest rates should be based on underlying supply and demand conditions for capital. Look at what happens to the divergence between the red and the blue line starting in about 2002. Big gap there. Red is what market interest rates should be to allocate capital effectively. Blue is what the interest rate actually was. It's reasonable to conclude from this that money was artificially, well, capital, I should say, was artificially cheap because of the money creation channel. Right? Now, when capital is artificially cheap, investors are fooled into thinking that it's hyper-abundant. Look, low market interest rate. It's boom time. Let's make a bunch of investment projects. But of course, this isn't the market actually signaling real relative resource scarcities. This is a funny money effect. This is the liquidity effect, as we call it in monetary economics. And so entrepreneurs tend to get fooled by this and invest in too many production processes that are not justifiable based on economic fundamentals. This is a streamlined version of the Austrian theory of the business cycle, pioneered by economists Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, who I had already mentioned. So when I show this graph to a lot of people, they always say, but wait, the federal funds rate is a short-term interest rate. It's literally the interest rate on overnight bank loans. We're talking about a boom in the mortgage market, the market for housing. Mortgages are long-term assets, 15, 20, sometimes even 30 years. How can it be that 30-year interest rates are so sensitive to short-run interest rates? Obviously, there's going to be some sensitivity. If there wasn't, there'd be financial arbitrage opportunities. But it's simply implausible to say that 30 and 15 long-term mortgages are going to be super sensitive to the short-term rate. Fair point. It wasn't the market for traditional mortgages that went bad in 2007, was it? It was the market for subprime mortgages. Now, the chief feature of those were adjustable rate subprime mortgages. You take out a loan, you get rates cheap for 2 years. Starting year 3, the rates would jump up to become high discontinuously. Why would people take that over a traditional mortgage? They didn't have the credit rating to get a traditional mortgage. Even then, why would you take it? Well, the idea is if housing prices across the country are appreciating, I'll take out my mortgage, and at the end of 2 years, once I've built up some equity in my house from natural price appreciation, I'll just refinance to a regular mortgage. Now that works great, so long as housing prices keep going up. If housing prices across the nation suddenly stall, or God forbid go down, then we're off to the races. And since this is specifically a short-term asset, this subprime mortgage, it's reasonable to conclude that that would be much more sensitive to a short-term interest rate. So we got to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples. This is the US nominal GDP gap. GDP is basically the dollar value of all newly produced goods and services in the United States. The red line is the trend line. That should be about 5 to 5.5% growth from just before 2005. That big drop that you see between 2005 and 2010 is the Great Recession. Now, if an asset bubble bursts, it's obviously going to have some effects. What we don't want is effects from money markets spilling over into real product markets. And monetary institutions can curb that problem. We know it in theory and we know it in practice. We've had monetary institutions other than central banking, I'll get to those in a little bit, that have actually done a reasonably good job at minimizing the fallout from asset bubble bursts when they actually do happen. That big gap simply should not have happened. More and more economists are starting to realize that. The consequence, of course, if that red line is where we could have been if the Fed had been doing its job, The distance between the two, actual output and estimated output, is how much poorer we all are. And as a rough back of the envelope calculation, that GDP gap is about 12%. Adjusting for population growth, that basically means that the average individual is between 8 and 9% poorer than we should be right now, because the Fed messed up handling the recession. That makes sense? So we have the ex-ante problems of inflating the housing bubble, and we have the ex-post problem of, frankly, not doing a very good job of dealing with this when it actually spilled over into final product markets. So what's the solution to all this? It's all well and good to say that central banking didn't do a good job, but if I don't have an alternative, it's meaningless. There's got to be something that can do it better. I think we can identify a bunch of things that can do it better. I'm going to talk about the theory behind that today. Why has central banking, and the Fed in particular, performed so poorly? I think it's because we're relying on the discretionary policy of a small committee that simply can't know enough to do their job well. Instead of the rule of law, we have the rule of central bankers, as my dissertation advisor, Professor Lawrence A. White, said in a recent paper. Now, for those of us who value liberal, contractual, private property society, this should really strike us as troubling. Money is not just an instrument to be fiddled with to achieve macroeconomic coordination. It is the foundational institution of commercial society. Think of how much poorer we would all be if we couldn't have a division of labor facilitated by money. It is the bedrock. It's the institution on which everything else is built. And as such, money, properly understood, should have the same status as other basic social institutions like private property itself, the family. These institutions that we hold are prior to the state, and therefore public policymakers cannot tread on these institutions without a darn good reason. So what we need is the same standard for infringing on monetary arrangements as the standard that we would hold public policymakers to if they wanted to infringe on private property or the family. What we need is to bring the rule of law to monetary affairs. By the rule of law, I mean that we need a monetary system which is stable, predictable, and non-discriminatory. These are all features of the rule of law that I'll explain right now. So again, we need generality, predictability, and non-discriminatory rules. Generality basically means that we don't have privileged legal groups, no different law for two categories of people. In Japan, for example, in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, it was illegal to disrespect a samurai if you were not a samurai, under pain of death. Of course, if you were a samurai, you could disrespect a samurai to heart's content. You'd probably end up in a duel to the death, but you could do it without being forcibly executed. There was a different law based off of social status. Right, so that's inherently contrary to modern post-Enlightenment, classically liberal notions of justice. No different law for different categories of people. Second requirement of the rule of law, predictability. We don't want our laws to be arbitrary. Like cases should be judged alike. Reasonable people should be able to have a reasonable expectation of how the law will apply in each particular circumstance. If you don't have that, you have arbitrary law. Last category, non-discrimination. We don't want our laws to be predatory. We don't want our politics to denigrate into a system of interest groups robbing each other. So in addition to laws being general and predictable, they should also enable the common good. Not the interest of any particular group, but the interest of society as a whole. Now, it seems to me that central banking fulfills the first, but fails on requirements 2 and 3. We can talk about a few instances of how that happens. One, monetary policy. The decision-making process is incredibly complex, and we don't know much about it. This small committee that has so much power to affect our lives and livelihood, we don't know exactly how they make their decisions. We just know that they do. Now, in their defense, they've become much more transparent in the past 20 or 30 years. But nonetheless, it's still not obvious why they do what they do and what they're going to do. Think about the recent turmoil in financial markets. People were generally unsure whether the Federal Reserve was going to raise interest rates or not. It's obviously a reasonable concern if you're undertaking an investment project or planning on it. You want to know what the price of capital is going to be. You want to know what's going to happen in financial markets. So financial markets breathed a sigh of relief when the Fed announced that it was going to keep interest rates basically at zero. But it's kind of bizarre that we're okay with a situation where there can be that much uncertainty in a system, especially as a system as important as money itself. So that seems to go against the predictability criterion. Obviously, the effects of inflation, the effects of bailouts, that cuts against the non-discrimination criterion. unexpected inflation redistributes resources from creditors to borrowers. That's an infringement of private property rights. Publicly funded bailouts redistribute resources from taxpayers on Main Street to the boardroom of Goldman Sachs. I shouldn't say Goldman Sachs, I should say some other bank that didn't do as good a job. Citi, Bank of America, AIG. That's clearly also an infringement of private property rights. So I hold that on these margins, monetary policy does not meet, as currently constituted, the requirements for true law, to be underneath a rule of law that is general, predictable, and non-discriminatory. All right, so let's talk about we've talked about some more obviously moral cases for applying the rule of law to monetary policy. Now let's actually go back and engage some strictly consequentialist / economic arguments for why, if we have a rule of law in monetary policy, not only is it morally laudable, but it's economically laudable as well. How the rule of law will actually help us maintain economic stability. Well, in the economics literature, there's this problem known as the time inconsistency problem. Just a fancy way of saying that even if we postulate a world where central bankers are omniscient and omnipotent and omnibenevolent, they only care about the public welfare and they are endowed with godlike knowledge, they still can't do their job because they have an incentive to promise to the public higher inflation than the public wants. Why? In the short run, unexpected inflation, in addition to redistributing resources, can actually create a false economic boom. The public likes it when the economy is booming, so if a central bank behaves only in the interest of the public, they should create that boom. The public's not stupid, it knows to expect that, so it revises its expectations in terms of the prices that they charge for their goods and services to embody that higher inflation. The result is no lower unemployment rate, but higher equilibrium inflation. If there was some rule binding the central bank's behavior, we could actually get that same unemployment rate, same output rate, but with lower inflation, which would obviously be a welfare improvement from the public's perspective. Now that was all a bit technical, but the important thing is that even if central bankers are angels, and even if they know everything that could be possibly known about how to run monetary policy, the situation is still less good than if we had rules. Think about how strong a statement that is. Even in a perfect world, we still need rules. Now take it back, march it back a little bit. Obviously, we don't live in a perfect world, so the case is even stronger. Monetary policymakers confront both information problems and incentive problems. The information problem is pretty straightforward. It's really, really hard to conduct central banking effectively, to maintain monetary coordination, monetary equilibrium. And furthermore, market actors are forward-looking, but government central bankers really have only access to past economic statistics to try and plan future decisions. Right? It's sort of like trying to drive a car by constantly looking in the rear view window. Of course, you're going to get into a wreck every now and then. And this isn't because central bankers are dumb or because they're not very nice. In fact, they tend to be people of very high personal integrity, and they tend to be incredibly sharp. This is just due to the nature of the job. It's incredibly hard. And I'm not frankly convinced that placing this knowledge burden on such a small committee that probably won't be able to do a good job with it is entirely fair to the public or to them. We frequently indict central bankers when really what we should be indicting is central banking. Now the incentive problem is a bit more obvious. Imagine a world, how should I put this? So central banking is not a neutral institution. And by that, I mean the kind of people who choose to become central bankers are not a representative sample of the economics profession. What kind of people are most likely to become central bankers? People who think that we need discretionary central banking in the first place. Milton Friedman never had a job as a central banker, even though he obviously was very important in the development of 20th century monetary policy. What this means is that, irrespective of truth value, central banking by discretionary policy is better able to compete on other margins in the marketplace for ideas than money and the rule of law. So even if lawful money will get us the best state of affairs, it's simply not going to be able to outcompete people who think that we need to do discretionary central banking. Because the people who end up in those institutions are selected by thinking that those institutions need to exist in the first place. This is not a conspiracy story. Right? Conspiracy requires active coordination. There is none here. This might be an example of what we call a bad spontaneous order, also the product of human action, not of human design. I again want to emphasize that central bankers tend to be men and women of incredible integrity and incredible intelligence, and this is really just due to the system itself. The thing itself is the abuse. And so we need to reform that if we want to have lasting change in the direction of increasingly lawful monetary policy. So how do we actually get towards lawful money? My proposal is that we embrace what might be called a monetary constitution. Now in economics, there is a field of study called constitutional political economy, which is the study of rules for rulemaking. We can think of day-to-day politics as that which creates the rules that we all have to live under. The Constitution of the United States is the rule sheet for how the rules have to be made, meta rules, so to speak. So when I'm saying that we need constitutional money, I'm not saying that we necessarily need a constitutional amendment governing the Fed, although that in my mind wouldn't necessarily be a bad idea. What I'm saying is that we need to have some binding rule placed on central bank behavior that central bankers themselves cannot change in the course of the ordinary operation of doing their jobs. A rule that you can choose to follow or not as you like is not a binding rule. It's not a rule itself, it's a guideline. And we know that rulemaking and rule imposition can actually improve central bank behavior and make it more lawful. So I think that's the direction that we need to go in. Now it's important that if we embrace a monetary constitution, that we don't jump to the other side and also bring monetary policy under the ordinary control of legislators. I don't much like monetary policy being under the control of unaccountable central bankers. I like it even less being under the control of congressional representatives who are on short-term election cycles. I don't think it takes much imagination to know that day-to-day congressional oversight of a central bank is a recipe for economic malcoordination. So we got to strike some balance. Obviously, the Federal Reserve is a congressionally created organization, so Congress has the authority to tell it what to do. But those rules that need to proceed from the legislature have to be at a higher level, right? They have to be something that central bankers cannot change, just in the ordinary course of policy. And it needs to be something that legislators cannot change in the ordinary course of policy. It needs to be something that has supermajority consensus, not 50% plus one, perhaps not even 2/3 for something as important as monetary policy. We've got to make sure that if we're going to mess with a rule for central banking, for monetary policy, that it has overwhelming supermajority consent. Now that's the structure of a monetary constitution. That's what the rules should look like in the abstract. What I haven't said anything about yet is what the rule should be. It's all well and good to say that central bankers should follow a rule. What rule are we talking about? Well, there are multiple rules that we can talk about. Each one has its pros and cons. The one that would change existing institutions the least, and therefore perhaps be the lowest cost to implement, would be a rule that would stabilize the purchasing power of money. In other words, basically give the Fed a zero inflation mandate. The purchasing power of the dollar today should be the same as the purchasing power of the dollar 100 years from now. It's reasonable to say that that might be a desirable solution. Excuse me. Obviously, if you have the stability of the purchasing power of your money over a very long time horizon, you can plan very long-term production projects. What's the longest term bond that any private for-profit corporation will issue these days? 30 years? People forget that railroads, when they were constructing their railroads, used to issue 100-year bonds. Think about that. A debt instrument with a 100-year duration. Why weren't they worried about fluctuations in the purchasing power and money during that time? Because we were on a gold standard. And that credibly committed the government to lock down the price level, the purchasing power of money. You didn't have to worry about rapid fluctuations because as long as we were on a gold standard, there couldn't be rapid fluctuations. Right? So stabilizing the purchasing power of money obviously has that benefit. There are costs though. There are some macroeconomic situations where there should be inflation, where the purchasing power of money should fall. Anytime you have what we call in economics a supply shock, when the factors of production get more expensive. OPEC raises oil prices. In order for markets to accurately signal all the information possible, goods in general have to get more expensive. How is that reflected? A fall in the purchasing power of money. So it's not the case that we always want zero inflation. There are some times when inflation is good. There are some times when deflation is good. Real productivity increases tend to cause benign deflation. Real productivity decreases tend to cause, I won't say benign inflation, but inflation that is necessary to get the market price system to give us the most accurate information possible. Now, obviously, if we have a zero inflation target for the Fed, we're sort of ruling that off the table. And so the price system might not be able to do as good a job at communicating relative resource scarcity. So that's a cost to a zero inflation regime. How about going back to the gold standard? This is one that I like a little bit more. Define the dollar in terms of a certain weight of gold. I think when Nixon took it, when Nixon closed the gold window in '71, it was $1 was 1/35 of an ounce of gold, I think. So do something similar. Figure how much gold is currently sitting in Fort Knox or wherever it's currently sitting in the basement of some Federal Reserve Bank. Figure out how many dollars are in circulation. There you go. That's your exchange ratio. Right? There can never be not enough gold to actually go back to the gold standard because the ratio at which we can attach dollars to gold is obviously up for determination right now. So what are the benefits of a gold standard? Well, we have another self-correcting mechanism here in monetary policy. If the purchasing power of money gets too high, right, that's going to incentivize changes in the gold mining industry that are naturally going to counteract that purchasing power of money getting too high. Right, so the link between gold mining and gold as money actually becomes a self-correcting mechanism rather than an agent of destabilization. Now, cons might be, now that we've tied money back to gold, changes in the supply and demand conditions for gold can actually have monetary effects, and we might not like that. Imagine some whiz kid out of MIT invents a new superconductor, and for some reason gold is a primary instrument in that. That's going to change the industrial uses of gold and hence the supply and demand conditions for gold. But since gold is our money, that's going to spill over into the money market as well, and has the potential to discoordinate, to malcoordinate the market for money, and that's going to have its familiar macroeconomic effects. There's no perfect way to do this. Any regime that you embrace is going to have some costs and some benefits. All you can do is say, okay, here are the criteria for lawful money, here are the costs and benefits associated with this proposed criteria, let's figure out which one's going to be best. Now, here's my personal favorite possibility. Instead of having a central bank, you could have a central bank managed gold standard. It's not a good idea in my estimation, but we've had it, so obviously it can exist. My alternative, if I just had my druthers, is to just get rid of the whole thing, repeal any and all laws that are specific to the financial sector and the money and banking sector. Have the only rules that apply to money and banking be ordinary law of property, contract, and torts, the Anglo-American common law. That situation would result in what we call laissez-faire or free banking. Under that situation, what is money? Well, either we can freeze the existing monetary base and just have paper Federal Reserve notes be our quasi-commodity money. That's one solution. Another solution is that we can go back to gold, where the market will take us to some other commodity that it wants to use as its base money. Who knows? It's a technological age. Maybe we'll all be using Bitcoin as our inside money. And so what happens in that scenario is that we have some outside money commodity that's determined outside the financial system. Banks keep that in their vaults, or if it's Bitcoin, on their computers. And what they issue, because now we have banks that are actually issuing their own money, is claims to that base money. If you took out a banknote under the national banking era before the Federal Reserve, what you got was a private banknote that enabled its bearer to go to that bank, present it on demand to redeem for a certain quantity of gold. Now, ordinarily, you don't keep around gold because it's more costly to store than paper. Right? So in the ordinary conduct of day-to-day commercial life, what people use as money is not base money itself, gold or Federal Reserve notes or Bitcoins or whatever. It's debt claims to money, bank-issued debt that's redeemable in whatever the underlying money commodity is. Now, we've had a lot of historical systems that have had great success with this system. The most important ones, I think, are 18th and early 19th century Scotland. This is the period when Scotland experienced rapid economic growth and went from being a backwater of the United Kingdom to basically being competitive with England as a place that was a center for artistic and intellectual flourishing. You all know about the Scottish Enlightenment, presumably, that happened during this time period. 19th century Sweden, for about 50 years, Sweden had a free banking system where outside money, the underlying money asset, was gold, and what people used as day-to-day money was bank-issued notes, redeemable in gold. In this 50-year period in Sweden, I think that there were 2 events that resembled the early stages of a banking panic in 50 years. In each of those events, no banks closed their doors. You had a 50-year period in Sweden where there were 0 bank failures. I think that's pretty remarkable. And last but not least, Canada, before World War I, and really up until World War II, had a system that looked exactly like this. Again, gold or silver or some mixture of the two is the base money. Banks keep gold and silver in their vaults and issue debt claims. That's what people use, keep in their wallets to trade with each other. Now, what's great about this system is that the supply and the demand of day-to-day money can adjust as people need it to. How? Well, banks know that every time period, some amount of individuals are going to come and present their banknotes for redemption. Let's say that we have a free banking system in the United States. Bank of America has gold sitting in its vaults. Every week, month, whatever, so many customers present Bank of America notes to Bank of America and say, I would like to redeem this for gold, please. Not very many do, but some do every time period. Now that's going to obviously affect the level of gold that's in your vaults. Imagine that over time you see the level of gold in your vaults building up, more and more gold. What does that mean? That means that individuals are more willing to hold on to your notes, or are willing to hold on to those notes for a longer period. Demand for your money has risen, and you know that by looking at how much gold is in your vault. So if you're a profit maximizing bank, and the public is willing to hold on to your notes, which is basically the public giving you, the bank, a zero interest loan, by the way. If you're a profit maximizing bank, what do? Print up a bunch more notes and spend them on things. That's exactly what should happen macroeconomically, because demand for money has risen. So we would want the supply of fiduciary media to rise to keep the money market well coordinated, so there are no negative effects on the prices of goods and services at large. Consider the same process in reverse. Imagine Bank of America has issued too many notes. Well, if it's issued too many notes, its float is too high, people are going to collect its notes, show up, redeem it. Right? Particularly other banks. Other banks are probably going to hold on to those notes. In the ordinary course of other clearing mechanisms, banks that are all looking to take market share from each other are going to say, hey, Bank of America, this is Citi. I have a bunch of your notes. Give me gold, please, in an attempt to capture market share at their expense, perhaps. Well, Bank of America is then going to see its gold reserves going down. What's that a signal to do? Call in loans, destroy some of the money that's too much in circulation. So that would be a situation where banks have both a personal profit incentive to correct an excess supply of money, but again, that's good for society as well. Too much money circulating fools people into thinking that we're actually in an economic boom. Money is abundant, let's spend it on things. Well, no, it's not just general economic prosperity, it's a funny money effect. But here, notice what's going on. Banks have actual access to profit and loss information, which the Fed doesn't currently have, to fix the problem. And even if Bank of America continues to make mistakes, it's still only one bank. There are a bunch of other banks who would be able to step in and fulfill market demand if Bank of America does something so silly that it has to close its doors. Right? So we have profit and loss for information alignment and incentive alignment, and we have multiple banks of issue that are contributing to the supply and the demand for money, or rather changes in the supply of money in response to changes in the demand for it. That's good because it means if any one of them messes up, the entire system is not going to feel the effects. It's probably going to be much more localized. Obviously, that's very different under current discretionary central banking. The Fed makes a mistake, everyone's got to feel it. Everyone's got to feel it. So what this really is, free banking, it's a system of no economic policy. No one's actively intending to stabilize the economy. And yet it happens anyway. So free banking itself stabilizes the macroeconomy as a kind of spontaneous order on its own. You can think of it as unintentional macro policy. You can think of it as a substitute for macro policy. It's getting us all of the effects. Stable markets, a price system that's best able to convey information, and we can do it all without maintaining the bureaucratic apparatus necessary to implement macroeconomic policy. So we can get rid of that, and there's a real resource savings there. All those brilliant economists who currently work for the Fed can go arbitrage in financial markets and help channel resources to their highest valued uses. That's a real wealth gain. What's bad about free banking? It would be difficult to conceive of an institutional arrangement more different than what we currently have than free banking. Nobody's seriously talking about going back to this, even though I think they should. Nobody's talking about this. This is not an option that's even on the table, even though it's my personal favorite option. So that's a cost in and of itself, right? We want lawful money. There are multiple ways to get there. This is one of them, but it's going to be really, really hard to convince people that this is an alternative worth taking seriously. So strategically, it might make sense to argue for a more limited example. Zero inflation, return to a gold standard, that sort of thing. But I'm going to be on record as saying this is the one that I prefer the most. I think that we have the most historical success with this kind of a system. Go ahead.
The free banking system then requires some stable commodity that becomes a measure of the value of
Yes.
the paper that's out,
Mm-hmm.
like gold.
Yes.
So it involves in a return to the gold standard in order to operate. Is that correct?
Either the gold standard or whatever the market wants to choose as money. It could choose gold if it wants, it could choose platinum, it could choose, again, Bitcoin if it felt so inclined. The easiest thing to do would be for the Federal Reserve, as its final act, to freeze the monetary base. There's so many dollars and coins out there, that's the base. That's going to be gold. That's going to be the outside money of the banking system. And banks will then issue debt claims redeemable in paper notes and coins. That's obviously a good way to fix the supply of the monetary base, which we would want fixed. So if we went back to a gold standard, we still have some chances of changes in the gold industry, technologies of production and stuff, having monetary effects. That's a cost. The benefit is that gold is very salient as money. It hasn't really lost its mystique, its awe as money. And I think that people would be much more comfortable accepting that system than the exact same system with either Bitcoin or old Federal Reserve notes as the ultimate base money. So there are costs and benefits that we have to talk about either way. But yes, you're ultimately right that there has to be some outside monetary commodity. Go ahead.
So yeah, sort of on the same series of two slides that Mallory's asking about, stabilized PPM, gold standard, or free banking, kind of similar to I guess, but basket of goods type things.
You could do that. That would be an alternative proposal. So two economists, Greenfield and Yeager, had a proposal where they would actually separate money's medium of exchange function from its unit of account function. There would be this hypothetical basket of goods, and we would stabilize that. And money instead would be a mutual fund where shares would be issued against that basket of goods. Now that's a really complicated system that has some nice economic effects, one of which is if there's a separation between medium of exchange and unit of account, there can no longer be an excess demand for or excess supply of money. Right? What's the cost? There has been, in my mind, since money has developed, I can't think of a single large-scale society that has embraced monetary arrangements that have come from separating the medium of exchange function from the unit of account function. Why? Because it's really convenient for these two things to go together. This is a very complicated, technical, weird proposal that not many people are going to understand. Why would you think that that would be the thing that the market process would dovetail towards? Even if we set that up, there are probably such significant cost savings from bundling medium of exchange function with unit of account function that people would probably just junk that old system and go back to something more familiar. So I think that might be an instance of economists being too clever for their own good, even though their hearts are ultimately in the right place. All right, in conclusion, I think I'll briefly summarize. We've covered a lot of territory, so let's recapitulate. Money greatly increases the extent of markets, but disordered markets, particularly disordered money markets, can result in macroeconomic problems. If there's a bunch of goods that are piling up on shelves that people don't want and businesses have to take losses and lay people off, that's your first clue that something's wrong in the money market. If something's wrong with one or two or maybe three markets, that's probably something localized there. If you see economy-wide breaks between what producers are producing and what consumers want, they've probably been misled somewhere, right? You're driving on the road and you see a car plowed into a stop sign. Probably a bad driver. You're driving on the road and you see 10 cars all plowed into each other. That's probably not 10 bad drivers. That's probably the stoplight system is broken. The coordinating system for driving has caused drivers to make mistakes. Same thing going on here. If you see widespread economic mistakes, something is probably funny with the money market. And that's where your attention should be focused. Money is one half of all exchanges, and so it's reasonable to conclude that if there's something wrong in the money market, it's going to affect all markets. Point two, central banking is the institution that economists have embraced to correct these problems, except it's not very good at it, especially the Fed. And I actually use the Fed as an example because it's interesting. The Fed has probably done the worst job out of all the modern central banks, which is, I think it's amusing because with the possible exception of the European Central Bank, it was the most consciously created. Right? The Bank of England had its roots in the King of England giving a particular bank a monopoly privilege because it wanted to have a bank finance its wars. And that sort of evolved over time to become a central bank. The Fed was created as a centralized institution for check clearing and formalizing the clearing process. And that also sort of evolved and became a central bank after a much shorter time period. So I think really the only central bank in history that was fully consciously created was the European Central Bank. And on the spectrum of central bank performance, they're actually not doing that bad. They're doing okay. But I think we should shoot for better than okay. I think that we should shoot for actual economic stabilization and lawful money. The European Central Bank has not behaved according to a rule of law. They have constitutionally adopted for the operation of their financial system, or the money system for the European Central Bank, a 2% inflation target. Their constitution explicitly says the ECB has one goal, and that goal is price stability. In repeated statements, the board that's responsible for monetary policy and the ECB has said, we interpret that to mean 2% inflation, as close to that as we can get. Of course, what happened as soon as you started having threats of a sovereign debt crisis in Greece, in Portugal, in Spain? They printed up a bunch of money and bought government debt, and that pushed inflation above 2% for a given time period. So again, unfortunately, words on pieces of paper do not tie central bankers' hands. We have to find institutional solutions that can actually do that. So it's been my contention that central banking is a fundamentally unlawful way of conducting monetary policy based off of standard norms that we hold about the rule of law as applied to the body politic in modern post-Enlightenment classically liberal societies. We need monetary policy that is general, predictable, and non-discriminatory, and only by embracing monetary policy that are these three things are we going to also get, as a side consequence, economic stability. If you shoot for economic stability, but you don't worry about the rule of law, we know exactly what that looks like. That looks like today's monetary institutions. If you instead embrace a constitution of liberty for the operation of money and banking, if you pass laws, rules of law that are general, predictable, and non-discriminatory, you can also have macroeconomic stabilization. So it's a case of make sure you're having fundamentally lawful money first, and you get the economic effects as a bonus. Do it the other way around, you get neither. Paraphrase of the famous Benjamin Franklin quote about liberty and security, except this time applied to monetary policy. Right, so lawful monetary institutions are going to require significant changes to the status quo. At a minimum, it requires a binding rule that the Fed cannot itself change, cannot itself interpret, it's got to follow the law, the rule, and also that the legislature can't arbitrarily meddle with as it wants. At most, it's going to require a fundamental restructuring of our money, banking, and financial system. This is actually a pretty good time to be having these conversations. For the first time in a long time, people are actually seriously talking about institutional changes to central banking. Nothing as radical as I'm proposing, but as long as changes are on the table, perhaps there'll be receptive ears in both legislative and scholarly economic circles for these kinds of proposals. Right, well, thank you very much for your time and consideration. It's been my pleasure to talk to you today. If there are any more questions, comments, or concerns, I will be happy to hear them and do as the best I can to answer them.
Another question that has to do with the current crop of candidates for president. And the question is, have you seen anything in any of their public statements indicating they have the remotest comprehension of the issues you have raised today?
No. The possible exception would be Rand Paul. I think, well, there are obvious reasons there, right? He got it while he was young. But aside from Senator Paul, nobody's talking about this stuff. And that's what worries me most, that among the current candidates for executive office, this doesn't really seem to be on the table. There's some movement in legislative circles. Congressman Kevin Brady, who's a Texas congressman, I believe, 8th district. Probably should check in on that, I'm not positive. He proposed in 2013 a bill called the Centennial Monetary Commission, which would basically be the converging creation of a commission to study monetary policy in the United States. So if that commission actually came about, the closest thing that we had in the past, I guess, would be the gold standard question commission that was brought about under the Reagan administration. But that would represent a unique opportunity, I think, to have this conversation in legislative circles. I have no idea what the status of that bill is right now, but there's some movement at least. So I would look to the legislative side of things rather than the executive side of things if we're looking for movement on this particular issue.
About the fourth or fifth slide, and then again in your conclusion, you talk about the things that the fourth or fifth slide, you talk about the things the Fed is responsible for, and then later that they're indictable for these two things. And again, you mentioned in your conclusion. I don't know your opinion on him. I don't have a firm one, but it struck me, it reminded me of something that Jim Grant said in an interview once about, he put it very, I guess nicely about how the Fed is notoriously late, you know, in their decisions one way or the other.
Right.
Anyway, it reminded me a lot of that.
So we have a conundrum in monetary.
Euphemism.
Yes, it's a conundrum in monetary arrangements that market actors are obviously forward-looking. They have to be market actors. But we don't really have great access to any metric that can tell us what those expectations of the future are. Right now, our institutional setup for central banking is such that, again, you have to use government statistics, compiled statistics, to get the best picture that you can of the economy. And those are highly imperfect at best, right? So you're looking at past data to tell you what to do about the future. Meanwhile, the people whose behavior you're trying to influence are looking at the future. So you have that disjoint there. Milton Friedman famously said that monetary policy is a blunt instrument that works with long and variable lags. Now the thinking in monetary policy, I'm going to paraphrase an economist named Scott Sumner, is that monetary policy works with long and variable leads. What monetary policy primarily works through is expectations of the future. And we don't really have any great information generating mechanisms that can tell us about that. We have the tip spread, which is the spread between a 10-year normal bond and a 10-year inflation-adjusted bond. That's obviously a good proxy for the market's expectations for inflation for the next 10 years. But really, we don't have the monetary institutional architecture to conduct monetary policy most effectively right now. And that's what's primarily worrying, I think, that you're right, that the Fed has to be backward-looking. It tries to be forward-looking, but it doesn't have any great way of doing that. Again, it's the nature of the job. I wouldn't want to be a central banker. They probably have it harder than most. So it's a thankless job and an incredibly difficult job, and I think we could save everyone a giant headache if we just tweak the institutions to take better access of the knowledge and the information and incentive alignment features of the market. Go ahead.
Going back to the laissez-faire choice, I think that I agree with you with that. I think that's where it should go. I don't see the point in going anywhere else. I realize strategically because nobody's there yet, nobody wants to get there, but why not go for what is correct first? And you mentioned something about repealing the laws that we have already, and that seems to be the biggest challenge, I think, is going to our legislators, people that are even campaigning, running, or candidates, and talking to them about repealing laws. They're so focused on just making laws. I wonder if you have any insight or any suggestions on how to come at, someone, or giving them a solution on how to repeal laws instead.
I wish I had something to offer on that. The only thing that comes to mind is that going forward, just pressure your representatives for any given measure that they sponsor to also include a sunset provision in that law, right? You want to mobilize public resources, but build in a date at which that program is going to come to an end. So even if that doesn't end up happening, at least you have something on paper where you can point to and say, look, this is unlawful. That obviously doesn't always help. The Federal Reserve is operating technically unlawfully in some respects, as you brought up earlier. But at least you have something down that you can point to and say, this law says X and you're doing Y. What's going on there? One thing that I didn't talk about, and bringing this back under the umbrella of monetary policy, I didn't talk about bailouts a whole lot today, but that's obviously relevant for money and the rule of law. The financial system likes having a big Fed that can act arbitrarily. A big system that can act, a big central bank that can act arbitrarily, that's a source of free purchasing power for banks when they get in trouble. Right? If you're an investment bank, if you're a financial firm of some kind, and you know that the options on the table are you can load up on risk, and if that works out, you make a killing. But if it doesn't, the central bank, the treasury, or both are going to bail you out. What incentive do you have to not take risk? Go to Vegas, why not? If it works out, you're rich. If it doesn't, you're rich. And so heads you win, tails the public loses.
Sounds like a great
So
place to be.
So you're gonna get a lot of pushback from financial elites, I think, if you want to make the argument for a lawful monetary policy, primarily because it's just not in their financial interests. And that's probably one of the biggest hurdles that we're gonna have to overcome. Go ahead.
It's interesting that radical is considered, I mean, free is considered radical, but I was curious, you said that sometimes it takes the public, they don't want to address things like this, and I've heard previously from, I guess, the 2007-08 crisis, the banking economy of Iceland has done something along those lines to where they were basically forced to deal with these issues with their banking system, and the too big to fails that they did not want to be a part of, and so they did something about that. Is that somewhat of a, I guess, an example of a modern dealing with, I guess, the public have to address these issues? If not, it's going to be an issue forever down the line. Is that an example of that, or?
The short answer is, I'm afraid I don't know. I don't know much about it. I know that something happened in Iceland. I don't know what the content of what the public demanded or what the laws were. They obviously were one of the hardest hit places by the financial crisis. And that obviously provides the impetus for people to pressure their representatives or however the legal system works there to change things. I really don't know anything about what's going on in Iceland. I don't know what the content of the law is or how it's working, so I'm afraid I can't help you there. I'm trying to think of, I should know some economists who are working on Iceland, since it's a salient example that a lot of people are paying attention to. But I'm drawing a blank, I apologize.
I was gonna say, I don't know that many people do, because I've seen the Iceland example used in memes, online and on Facebook by, Tea Party friends and Occupy Wall Street friends, and they're both using it, as their justification. So there's a pretty good chance, I think, that nobody really
Understands, yeah.
Fair enough. Chuck?
I wonder if you might describe the role of Cantillon effects under all the different alternative monetary arrangements that you've discussed today.
Cantillon effects, excellent. Okay. Wow, that's a hard question. So Cantillon effects are basically relative price changes resulting from monetary policy, changes in the supply of money relative to the demand for it. In markets, what actually allocates resources, or one of the primary determinants for how resources are allocated, are relative prices. So not the price of apples in the abstract, but the price of apples relative to oranges. That's going to influence who has the purchasing power to buy tractors, fertilizer, who investors are going to invest in, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it's important to note that when you change the supply of money in the economy, that doesn't affect all prices equally at the same time. Someone gets that money first. They spend it on what they want. That's going to have some effect on relative prices. Then the second recipients get it, and they're going to spend it, and that's going to have some effect on relative prices. So there's some concern that arbitrary changes in the money supply, by messing with the structure of relative prices, can actually become an agent of macroeconomic destabilization. So you have to worry not only about the quantity of money in the economy relative to the demand to hold it, but also how changing the supply of money is going to impact relative prices. And I think it's a fair approximation to say that those effects are going to be smallest the more organizations that you have responsible for changing the supply of money. Right? So when you just basically have the Fed, there's going to be a single cascade of Cantillon effects stemming from the fact that the financiers get it first, and then whoever they purchase from get it second, et cetera, et cetera. If you have free banking, right, the opposite end of the spectrum, with the supply and demand of money constantly changing, and the nominal supply of money relative to the demand for it constantly changing as profit maximization conditions dictate, yeah, you're going to have many more Cantillon effects, but each one is going to be of a much smaller magnitude, and primarily their effects are going to be localized. And so to the extent that if Cantillon effects are small enough, we don't worry about them having too much of an effect on relative resource allocation, I think the Cantillon effects, which are something that we do need to take seriously, are going to be most manageable under a system of free banking and central banking. That's my 2 cents on it.
Thank you.
I don't want you to, if you're going to turn to the slide, I don't want you to do it yet.
Okay.
But on the slide you had a first graph, the federal funds rate versus the estimated Taylor rule rate. I was kind of struck when I saw that. Because, I mean, it wasn't a slide of, you know, I guess let's make sure what it is versus what it's not first. But it's not a slide of free banking that you're proposing versus, you know, managed, or maybe it is to some degree.
So what I meant to convey with that slide is simply that the Fed goofed for a little while by keeping interest rates too low for too long. I don't think that under a system of free banking that any one bank would have that capacity to have that effect on market interest rates. And really this goes back to how hard central banking is, right? Why did they keep monetary policy too loose for too long in that time period? They were worried about the after effects, the lingering bad effects of the dot-com bust, right? 1999, 2000, when there were troubles in asset markets that we were worried would spill over into other markets, right? Greenspan put the pedal to the metal to try and minimize the effects of that. And for all I know, that was the rational decision to make at the time, right? The whole point of this is that it's really, really hard to know when you're doing a good job or not under central banking. And when you mess it up, the effects can be catastrophic.
But you were kind of, and maybe this was just my misinterpretation, you were kind of directing our attention toward the latter half of that slide. I think marked on there were 2010 and 2005 or something.
Do you mind if I turn to this?
No, go ahead. What struck me most, yeah, that one. You know, so our attention is drawn to the big trough around 2002 to 2005.
Right.
But it wasn't just there. There's also the one pre-95, and even the one where it was the other way, around 90. And so what struck me the most was, you know, according to the standard model, we need central banking to remove, you know, a lot of the volatility out. But if you draw the best fit lines, you know, on both of those, I know that's, you know, not the entirety of the 20th century or whatever, but it is a good chunk of time. And the best fit lines on those, you know, tend to point toward there being more stability under a more market-oriented, which is, I think, what the Taylor rule attempts to approximate. Is that right?
I think it's a reasonable approximation. So technically the Taylor rule, all it is a rule for adjusting the policy rate, or the target for the Fed funds rate, as conditions in the macroeconomy change. Since it's geared toward maintaining what macroeconomists call full employment, making sure society has no idle resources, that we're producing as much as we can, I think it's also a reasonable approximation for the interest rate that is necessary to bring capital markets into equilibrium. The quantity of saved resources equals the quantity demanded for saved resources. That's investing, right, for investment projects. So if we take the Taylor rule as a rough and ready approximation for what interest rates should be, such that capital markets are equilibrating, are coordinating right, then the divergence becomes worrisome. Right? What should actually be on the board for the red line is what Newton Excel called the natural rate of interest. Right? But of course we don't observe the natural rate of interest. We can't possibly know what it is. There are better and worse approximations of it. The Taylor rule is perhaps the most popular, decent approximation of it. So that's why I just chose to include that diagram. And speaking of free banking, changing the subject slightly, a lot of people have it in for free banking, and I'm now talking about economists because they point to the early United States history. The wildcat banking era before the Civil War, and then the national banking system after the Civil War, which even though it wasn't obviously worse than the Fed, did have its problems, right? We had a financial panic once every about 10 years following the Civil War. That was not free banking, not at all. Again, what you need for free banking is no special rules on money and banking that restrict banks' ability to change the supply of money in the economy as economic circumstances permit. There are two kinds of costly rules restraining banks, both in the antebellum period and in the national banking system. It's just a matter of whether the states or the national government are enforcing those rules. First, you had capital requirements, right? Actually, capital requirements aren't that. Forget I said capital requirements. That's another thing that we can talk about. But I actually want to talk about branching restrictions. Right? It was frequently very difficult or impossible to open multiple branches of banks across state lines. Now that's obviously important because if you can only have one branch, you're limiting yourself to being really vulnerable to geographic specific risks. If you're a bank in the Midwest and you're loaning primarily to farmers and there's a bad harvest, guess what? That's your financial portfolio. You're going to go under. And since other banks are holding your debt claims as assets, they're going to go under. all of a sudden we're off to the races and we have the makings of a financial crisis. If I were able to open a branch in, say, San Francisco, where economic conditions are completely different, I could wire my San Francisco branch, telegraph, and say, hey, we're having some trouble here. We need some emergency liquidity. Can you get some out to us? And so that way you could be more accommodating for geographic specific risk. Canada did not have those kinds of restrictions. And so what you tended to observe was a relatively small number of banks that had national branching. And so when there was a problem in the East, they could go to the West for emergency liquidity. That was much harder to do in the US. Also, and here's another big one, the amount of money that banks could issue, their note issuance, their float, as it were, depended on their posting of collateral with some government office. So if you wanted to issue X dollars worth of bank-denominated money, you had to buy 80% of X's worth in government bonds and post that either at the state controller's office or whatever office was responsible for managing the national banking system. What does that mean? It means that the amount of money that you could issue was tied down to the value of government debt, which means that you couldn't freely adjust the supply of money as demand conditions required. If there was a giant spike in the demand for money, the economically efficient thing would be for banks to issue more money, issue more debt claims. But I can't do that because I'm constrained by this law that says I can't issue any more money than 80% worth of whatever the bond is that I posted at the controller's office. Now, obviously, I can go through the process of doing more, but that takes time. And in that time, the excess demand for money is having pernicious economic effects. Again, what we observed in Canada, no laws like this. And so as supply and demand conditions adjusted, Canadian banks were most able to facilitate changing market conditions. Right? It's why financial markets in Canada tended to be much more stable than financial markets in the US. Right? We actually have pretty nice natural experiments where we have banks in Michigan, we have data on interest rates for those banks that are prevailing in US markets and also interest rates that Canadian banks were charging and prevailing in Canadian markets. And what we would see for US banks is big seasonal fluctuations in market interest rates. Right? As the harvest season comes, and farmers need money, cash to bring their crops to market, they would all withdraw cash from the bank. That would cause interest rates to spike in the short term, right? Precisely because there wasn't necessarily enough cash to satisfy them all, and so you'd have to actually draw down capital. There was no such interest fluctuations in Canada, much more stable. What did fluctuate a lot in Canada was the supply of money. So you had the quantity of money fluctuating, but not market interest rates. Or in the US, you had the opposite scenario. You had big fluctuations in market interest rates and not much fluctuation in the supply of money. Right? From an economic efficiency standpoint, Canada is the way you want to go, most certainly. Question?
Well, more really, I guess, a comment, but the three rules of law that you mentioned, avoiding a privileged class and arbitrary, predatory, whatever,
Yes.
of all of those, kind of based on more of a moral code as much as anything else. And when Brandon was talking about, or asking about Iceland, I know nothing about the Iceland thing, but I think at some point before people will be willing to actually take a fresh look at all of this, it probably will have to completely crash. People just don't change status quo unless there's some drastic, self-important reason for it. And as you can tell from the lack of folks that are here on Saturday morning, there's not too many people even thinking about such things. Everything is on such a surface pop culture level. Very few people even have any idea of Austrian economics at all. So.
Which is why I'm very pleased that you're all here.
Not to be discouraging, I'd love to see it all work out, but it seems like there's always a predatory effect, and they thought they were controlling that, but then whoever's in control tends to favor whoever's backing them or whatever. So it's just as a long-time observer.
James Buchanan, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1986, I believe, was a co-author of a book called Politics by Principle, Not by Interest. And the subtitle was called Towards Non-Discriminatory Democracy. And the whole point of that book was to find a way to institutionalize what he called generality norms. for passing laws that require supermajority consensus to actually get through the legislative process. And it's not hard to see why. The more people required to agree to a law, well, if I agree to a law, chances are it's not going to exploit me, at least not in my view. People don't tend to agree to things that exploit them. So if we have a higher decision-making threshold for laws, that might be a way to constrain the predatory state while also unleashing the protective and productive state. So your statement made me think of that. I'm not a scholar of social change, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying. Usually it's business as usual until a crisis moment. And in crisis moments, I think that you have a genuine chance for ideas to compete on their merits.
There just seems to be a lot of comfort of the people who sort of rig the system to keep it the way it is.
Yeah. I don't blame the people who rig the system all that much. They're probably just following their own self-interest within the rules as they see it. And part of the reason all this is so pernicious is that nobody intends it, right? Nobody intended a bailout-friendly, big banks-friendly financial system. It just sort of happened as the consequence of 50, 60 years of bargains between financial elites and government agents and central bankers.
Nobody campaigns, I'm for bailouts.
Yeah,
Vote
right.
for me.
Leviathan, right, the predatory state is not this, it's not Thomas Hobbes's, all-powerful dictator / king who's just actively taking stuff from you. It's this mess of this government agency and that government agency, each one doing its own thing. And so nobody in particular is responsible for the effects. And so it's that sort of cancerous unintended growth that I think is a big challenge to overcome.
I've just lived a long time. It seems a little, maybe I've gotten cynical about it over the years.
I'll trust your opinion more than I'll trust mine on this one.
When you said, taking, I guess, instead of an international approach, you said that sometimes crisis, I guess, instigates conversation or response. We talk about federal control compared to states' rights issues. Would Texas's response with this gold bank that they've started an answer to something like that?
I'm not familiar with this. Can you tell me a
I'm
little
pretty
bit
sure
more
it's
about it?
just happened to where I believe it's been
Into the
signed
legislature.
into the legislature, something along these lines, that Texas is starting its own gold bank.
We're bringing theirs home.
Wants to withdraw it from the New York Fed and other places to have here as a, I guess, backup compared to the national level. I mean, I'm still learning about it, but I know that Texas does have this new issue with the Texas Gold Bank. I didn't know if that was
I had
I
not
saw
heard
it when it
anything
came out
about
and I
it.
haven't heard anything
Anything else
since.
about it?
Yeah.
It was major at first and then it was just like nothing's really come out of it at all.
I'll be paying Google a visit later.
So I believe that might be what we're discussing here, something along those
Resign
lines.
now, we're going to mail it back to Texas, just in case.
In case they pull out.
So, generally, in a constitutional republic such as ours, I'm a big fan of federalism, subsidiarity, right? Those are sort of the institutional conditions necessary for liberty to flourish, I believe. I don't want to comment on the specifics of this proposal, given that this is the first I've heard of it. So I'll take a look and then I'll see if I can't suss out what the economic consequences might be if it actually goes through. But thank you for bringing that to my attention.
I guess my question's kind of a follow-up to the first one I asked. First one addressed kind of the money side of things. I want to try and get you to talk a little bit more about the rule of law issues related to our current monetary arrangement. Given that the current system has many monopolistic characteristics, how does the creation of these Cantillon effects impact incentives for participation in political and policy-making processes that are related to the issues that you've brought up?
So I guess the size of the Cantillon effects would also correspond to the size of the benefit from who gets the new money first. So I don't know how big that benefit is relative to how important it is that the banks that want bailouts get the money at all.
Right.
Right. So in my estimation, the size of Cantillon effects is not necessarily of political import. It's the fact that banks want those resources in the first place, and then Cantillon effects, however large or however small they are just the natural consequence of that sort of behavior. Part of the problem is that we have no idea how to measure these things, right? Because in order to do a proper experiment, you need a counterfactual of some kind that bears some resemblance to what we have. We just don't have that in economics. So people have been trying for a long time to measure how big Cantillon effects are. And we sort of have opinions on that, but those opinions are more intuitive than empirically founded. But my guess would be the political process would be sort of invariant to the size of Cantillon effects. It more just matters who's creating the liquidity ex nihilo and who's getting it. period, rather than who's getting it first, per se.
Okay.
Anything else? Well, again, thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you
It's
so
been a pleasure.
much.
Thank you for coming to the event, and then please note, just tell everybody about the LubbockLiberty.com website so that they can go and view the video, and it should be up in a couple of weeks, but you can go back and watch any other event that we've had in the past. I think there was just one that we recorded, but we have not got permission to release yet, so we're waiting for that one. It was about the NSA surveillance state by Benjamin Cliff. So we're looking forward to putting that out there and
That was
seeing
the
how
one
many.
out at Groves.
Yep, that's right, that was at the other library, but absolutely, thank you so much, Alex, for coming out. It was truly an honor, and I felt very privileged to be able to sit here and listen to you.
Likewise to be here. I always like talking about this. So thank you again for the invitation.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Chuck. Always.